The rain came down like nails on the tin roof of the Greene County farmhouse, each drop a sharp percussion that echoed across the empty fields. It was the kind of rain that turned dirt roads into rivers of mud and made the world disappear beyond the porch light's weak yellow glow. The kind of rain that soaked through to the bone in seconds. Margaret Hollis stood on that porch, her thin cotton dress clinging to her skin, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to hold in what little warmth remained. Her teeth chattered so violently she had to clench her jaw to make them stop. Water streamed from her hair down her face, mixing with tears she couldn't afford to shed, not yet, not while she could still feel her fingers. Through the living room window, she could see him. Robert Hollis sat in his leather recliner, the blue glow of the television washing over his face as Johnny Carson's monologue played to an audience that roared with laughter. The volume was turned up loud enough that she could hear it through the glass, through the storm, through the locked door that separated her from shelter. She had forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning. That was all. One errand among the dozen she'd completed that day, the grocery shopping, the bank deposit, the prescription refill at Morrow's Pharmacy on Main Street. But the dry cleaning, his good suit for the Rotary Club dinner on Saturday, that had slipped her mind when Mrs. Patterson had stopped her outside the A&P to discuss the church bake sale. "You had one goddamn job today that mattered," he'd said when she came through the door with bags of groceries but no garment bag. "One thing I needed, and you couldn't get that right." She'd apologized. Of course she had. She'd offered to drive back into town immediately, though the storm was already rolling in, dark clouds boiling over the eastern hills like smoke from a tire fire. But Robert had that look in his eyes, the one she'd learned to recognize over their 6 years of marriage. The look that said her apology wasn't enough, that she needed to understand the weight of her failure. "Get out," he'd said, gesturing toward the door with his tumbler of whiskey. "Get out of my house. Robert, please. I said get the hell out." She'd backed toward the door, still clutching the car keys, thinking maybe if she just stepped outside for a moment, let him cool down, she could come back in once he'd poured himself another drink, and the anger had settled into its usual cold silence. But when she turned to come back inside, the lock had clicked into place. The deadbolt, the one she didn't have a key for because Robert said she didn't need one, he was always home before her, wasn't he? That had been 40 minutes ago, or maybe an hour. Time moved strangely in the cold, stretching and contracting like something alive. The rain had started as a drizzle, but now fell in sheets, driven sideways by wind that howled across the soybean fields. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the landscape in brief, white-hot flashes that made the darkness afterward seem absolute. Margaret hammered on the door again, her fists numb and clumsy. "Robert, Robert, please." Her voice was raw from shouting, competing with the storm and the television and his indifference. Through the window, she watched him take a sip of his drink. He didn't even glance toward the door. She thought about the car, parked in the gravel driveway 30 feet away. The keys were still in her hand, but her fingers had gone so numb she couldn't feel the metal anymore. She could drive to her sister's place, 20 miles south on Route 41. But the idea of navigating those dark roads in this storm, with visibility down to nothing and the creeks already rising, that seemed more dangerous than staying put. And leaving would mean admitting defeat. It would mean this was who she'd become, a woman who got locked out of her own home for forgetting dry cleaning. A woman who ran away instead of standing her ground. So she stayed on the porch, shivering and soaked, watching her husband watch television in the warm, dry living room, and she wondered how it had come to this. The headlights appeared first as a dim glow through the rain, then resolved into twin beams that swept across the front of the house as the vehicle turned into the driveway. Margaret squinted through the downpour, her heart hammering with sudden hope. The car was big and boxy, the unmistakable silhouette of a full-size sedan, and even before it pulled to a stop beside her Chevrolet Impala, she saw the light bar on the roof. "Sheriff's Patrol." The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out into the rain, reaching back inside for his hat before closing the door with a solid thunk that spoke of Detroit steel and American manufacturing, back when cars were built like bank vaults. He was tall, with shoulders that filled out his tan uniform shirt even in the rain, and he moved with the deliberate economy of someone who'd learned not to waste motion. Sheriff Tom Miller had been Greene County's top lawman for 12 years, ever since he'd come back from Korea with a Purple Heart and a quiet intensity that made men think twice before starting trouble. He was 53 years old, with iron gray hair cut military short and eyes the color of weathered denim. He drove a 1967 Dodge Polara in unmarked beige because he said a sheriff didn't need flash, just reliability and a strong engine. He walked toward the porch, rain streaming off the brim of his hat, and stopped at the bottom of the 3 wooden steps that led up to where Margaret stood shivering. "Mrs. Hollies." His voice was quiet, pitched just loud enough to carry over the rain. Not a question. He knew who she was. In a county of 4,000 people, everybody knew everybody. "Sheriff," her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, broken by the cold. "How long you been out here?" I'm not sure, an hour maybe." Miller's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. His eyes moved from her soaked dress to the locked door, then to the window where Robert Hollies still sat in his recliner, laughing at something on the television. "He lock you out?" Margaret hesitated. The instinct to protect, to make excuses, was still strong despite the cold that had seeped into her bones. "I forgot to pick up his dry cleaning." He was angry. "So he locked you out, in a thunderstorm." Miller said it flatly, without inflection, but something in his tone made it sound like the most damning evidence in a murder trial. "I just need him to open the door. If you could just—" "Ma'am, with respect, that's not what you need." Miller climbed the porch steps, his boots loud on the wood despite the rain. "What you need is to get warm and dry. What he needs is to learn that in Greene County, we don't treat women like livestock." He moved past her to the door and knocked. Not the frantic pounding Margaret had been doing, but 3 solid strikes with the side of his fist that made the door rattle in its frame. The sound cut through even the television noise. Inside, Robert Hollies looked up, annoyed. When he saw the sheriff's uniform through the window, his expression shifted to something between irritation and wariness. He set down his drink, stood up, and walked to the door. But he didn't open it. "What do you want, Miller?" His voice was muffled by the wood, but still carried that edge of entitlement that came with being the owner of Hollies Agricultural Supply, the biggest farm equipment dealer in 3 counties. "Open the door, Robert. This is a private matter, between a man and his wife. Open the door, or I'll open it for you." Through the window, Margaret saw Robert's face flush with anger. "You can't just— this is my property. You got no right." "I got every right." Tennessee Code Annotated, Section 3913-111, domestic assault. That includes placing someone in fear of imminent bodily injury, which I'd say qualifies when you lock a woman outside in 40-degree rain for an hour. Miller's voice never rose, never lost that flat, measured quality, but each word landed like a judge's gavel. "Now open this door, or I'm coming through it." "I'll file a complaint. You can't just barge into a man's home because his wife—" Miller didn't wait for him to finish. He turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, step to the side, please." She moved to the far end of the porch, her back against the wet siding, and watched as Sheriff Miller tried the door handle one more time. Still locked. He nodded to himself, as if confirming something he'd already known. Then he took 3 steps back and drove his shoulder into the door. The frame splintered with a crack that cut through the rain like a gunshot. The door flew inward, the deadbolt tearing through the wood, and suddenly the warm air from inside rushed out to meet the cold, creating a visible mist in the porch light. Robert Hollies stumbled backward, his face going white. "You son of a bitch, you broke my door." Miller stepped inside, rain dripping from his uniform onto the carpet. "Mrs. Hollies, come inside and get warm. There's a bathroom down that hall, I believe. Go get yourself dried off." Margaret didn't move at first. Her legs had gone stiff from the cold, her muscles locked up. But Miller's voice had that quality of calm command that made disobedience seem impossible, so she forced herself to walk forward, past Robert who stood there with his mouth open, past the sheriff who stepped aside to let her through. The warmth of the house hit her like a physical blow, so intense after the cold that it was almost painful. She stumbled down the hallway to the bathroom, her wet shoes squeaking on the hardwood floor. Behind her, she heard Robert's voice rise in pitch. "This is breaking and entering. I'm calling my lawyer." "You do that." Miller's voice was still calm. "But first, you're going to listen to me." Margaret closed the bathroom door and leaned against it, her whole body shaking now that she was out of the rain. She could hear their voices through the door, muffled but angry. Robert's high and defensive, Miller's low and steady. She peeled off her soaked dress and wrapped herself in the large bath towel from the rack, the one with her monogram that her mother had given her as a wedding gift. The towel smelled like the lavender detergent she always used, familiar and safe. In the mirror, she looked like something that had crawled out of a river, hair plastered to her head, skin pale and mottled from the cold, eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She looked like a victim. She looked like someone who needed saving. The thought made something twist in her chest, shame and relief fighting for dominance. When she emerged from the bathroom 10 minutes later, dressed in dry clothes from her bedroom, she found Sheriff Miller standing alone in the living room. Robert was nowhere to be seen. "Your husband is in the patrol car," Miller said before she could ask. "I'm taking him in." "Taking him in, you mean arresting him?" The word felt foreign in her mouth, like something from a television show, not her real life. "Yes, ma'am, for domestic assault." Miller pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket and flipped it open. "I need to ask you some questions if you're up to it. How long were you outside?" "An hour, maybe longer. And this happened because you forgot to pick up dry cleaning?" "Yes." The shame of it washed over her again. "I know it sounds." "It sounds like a man who wanted an excuse to hurt his wife," Miller interrupted gently. "Has he done this before, locked you out, or anything similar?" Margaret hesitated. The instinct to protect Robert, to protect her marriage, was still strong. But standing there in her dry clothes, in her warm house that she'd been locked out of, the absurdity of that instinct suddenly became clear. "Not exactly like this," she said slowly. "But there have been incidents, times when he's made me feel." She stopped, unable to find the words. "Afraid," Miller supplied quietly. Margaret nodded, tears finally spilling over. "Yes." Miller wrote something in his notebook, his face impassive. "Mrs. Hollies, I'm going to be straight with you. What your husband did tonight was a crime. Not just mean, not just wrong, an actual crime under Tennessee law. And I'm going to charge him with it." "But what if I don't want to press charges?" The question came out automatically, the way she'd been trained to respond: protect the peace, protect the marriage, protect Robert's reputation. "That's not how it works anymore," Miller said. "As of last year, the state can prosecute domestic assault cases even without the victim's cooperation. You don't have to press charges. I already did." The relief that flooded through her at those words was so intense it made her knees weak. She didn't have to make the choice. She didn't have to be the one to destroy her marriage. The decision had been taken out of her hands. "What happens now?" she asked. "He'll be held for at least 24 hours. There'll be a hearing, probably Monday. The judge will set conditions for his release, likely a protective order that keeps him away from you for a while." "Away from me, but this is his house." "It's your house too, ma'am. You live here. You have just as much right to be here as he does." The concept was so foreign to her thinking that she couldn't quite process it. In 6 years of marriage, she'd never once thought of this house as hers. It was Robert's house, Robert's property, Robert's kingdom where she was merely a subject. "Is there someone you can call?" Miller asked. "Family, a friend, someone who can stay with you tonight?" "My sister, Helen, she lives over in Clarksville. You should call her. You shouldn't be alone right now." Margaret nodded, though the thought of calling Helen, of admitting what had happened, filled her with dread. Helen had never liked Robert, had warned Margaret against marrying him. Being proven right wouldn't make Helen cruel. She wasn't that kind of person, but it would still sting. "I'll call her," Margaret said. Miller closed his notebook and tucked it back in his pocket. "All right. I'm going to get your husband processed and booked. I'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement. Around 10, if that works." "Yes, I can do that." "Good." Miller walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Mrs. Hollies, what your husband did tonight, that's on him, not on you. You didn't forget to pick up dry cleaning. You forgot to pick up dry cleaning. Those are two very different things." She stared at him, not understanding at first. Then it clicked, the emphasis, the distinction he was making. She had simply made a mistake, a mundane human error. What Robert had done in response was the real transgression. "Thank you," she whispered. Miller tipped his hat, a gesture that seemed to come from an earlier, more courteous era. "You take care now." He left, pulling the broken door closed behind him as best he could. Through the window, Margaret watched him walk to his patrol car, saw the silhouette of Robert in the back seat, hands presumably cuffed behind his back. The taillights disappeared down the driveway, red smears in the rain, and then she was alone in the house. The silence felt enormous after the storm and the shouting and the crash of the door breaking. Margaret stood in her living room, dripping water onto the carpet despite her dry clothes, and for the first time in 6 years, she felt like she could breathe. She picked up the phone and dialed her sister's number. Helen answered on the third ring, voice groggy with sleep. "Hello? Helen, it's Margaret, I need help." There was a pause, then Helen's voice came back sharp and alert. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "No, I mean not physically, but Robert, he locked me out. In the rain. The sheriff arrested him." "Oh, honey?" Helen's voice broke with relief and fury in equal measure. "Oh, thank God. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't you move, don't you dare go anywhere." Margaret hung up the phone and sat down on the couch, still warm from where Robert had been sitting just an hour ago, watching television while she froze outside. The absurdity of it hit her all at once, and she started to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that bordered on hysteria, the kind that could easily turn into sobs if she let it. But she didn't let it. Instead, she sat there in the warm house and laughed until the headlights of Helen's car appeared in the driveway. The next morning, Sheriff Tom Miller sat in his office at the Greene County Sheriff's Department, a cinder block building on the edge of town that had been built in 1952 and looked every year of its age. The coffee in his mug had gone cold while he worked through the paperwork from the night before. Arrest report, property inventory, incident narrative, chain of custody forms, the bureaucracy of justice each form a small brick in the wall between Robert Hollies and his wife. His deputy, Jake Henderson, stuck his head through the doorway. "Sheriff, Hollies' lawyer is here, says he wants to talk to you about dropping the charges." Miller didn't look up from his paperwork. "Tell Mr. Brennan that I don't drop charges, the district attorney does, and he can make an appointment like everyone else." Jake grinned. "Thought you might say that." He disappeared, and Miller heard the muffled sound of voices in the lobby, one of them rising in indignation. 5 minutes later, his phone rang. Miller picked it up. "Sheriff Miller. Tom, it's Bill Brennan. We need to talk about this Robert Hollies situation." Miller leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest. "I'm listening." "Look, Robert's a respected member of this community. He owns the biggest business in 3 counties. What happened last night was a marital dispute that got out of hand. There's no need to ruin the man's life over it. He locked his wife outside in a thunderstorm for over an hour, Bill. That's not a dispute, that's assault. She's not even pressing charges. She doesn't have to. I witnessed the aftermath. That's enough." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Brennan spoke again, his tone had shifted from cajoling to threatening. "You know Robert has friends on the county commission, friends who control your budget. It would be a shame if this turned into a political issue." Miller felt his jaw tight. "Is that a threat, Bill?" "It's a reality check. You're up for re-election next year. Robert has a lot of influence in this county." Then I guess Robert should have thought about that before he committed a crime. Miller hung up the phone without waiting for a response. His hand was shaking slightly when he set the receiver down. Not from fear. He'd faced worse than county commissioners in Korea, but from anger. The idea that money and influence could buy immunity from consequences for hurting another human being made his blood boil. Margaret Hollies arrived at 10 o'clock exactly, accompanied by her sister. She looked better than she had the night before, color back in her cheeks, eyes clearer. But there was still a fragility to her that made Miller think of a bird with a broken wing, healing but not yet ready to fly. He took her statement in the small interview room at the back of the station, with Helen sitting beside her for support. Margaret recounted the events of the previous night in a quiet, steady voice, only faltering when she got to the part about standing outside in the rain. "How long would you say you were outside before I arrived?" Miller asked. "At least an hour, maybe longer. I lost track of time." "And your husband could see you from inside the house?" "Yes, through the window. He was watching television." Miller wrote this down, his face expressionless. "Did he say anything to you through the door?" "No, I was shouting, begging him to let me in, but he never responded. He just sat there." The deliberateness of it, the calculated cruelty, made it worse somehow. If Robert had locked her out in a rage and then forgotten about her, that would still be unforgivable. But to sit there watching television while his wife froze outside, that was something else entirely. "Mrs. Hollies, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Has your husband ever physically hurt you? Hit you, pushed you, anything like that?" Margaret glanced at her sister, then back at Miller. "No, not physically, but he's done other things, thrown things near me, punched walls. Once he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, but that was just because I tried to leave during an argument." "When was that?" "3 months ago," she said it quietly, ashamed. "I should have left then, I know that now." "You're here now," Miller said. "That's what matters." He finished writing and closed his notebook. "This statement will be part of the case file. The DA will review it and decide how to proceed. In the meantime, there will be a hearing Monday morning to set bail and conditions of release." "Will I have to be there?" "You can be, but you don't have to be. The state is prosecuting this case, not you personally." Margaret nodded, relief evident on her face. After they left, Miller sat at his desk and stared at the statement he'd just taken. In his 12 years as sheriff, he'd seen plenty of domestic situations. Some of them ended with arrests, most of them didn't. It was the nature of the crime, private, hidden behind closed doors, often denied by the victim out of fear or misplaced loyalty. But this one felt different. Maybe because he'd seen Margaret standing on that porch, soaked and shivering. Maybe because Robert Hollies' indifference had been so blatant, so callous. Or maybe because Miller was tired of watching powerful men hurt vulnerable people and face no consequences. Whatever the reason, he was going to see this through, even if it cost him his job. The hearing on Monday morning was held in the Greene County Courthouse, a brick building with white columns that had been standing since before the Civil War. Judge Harrison Blackwell presided, a 68-year-old veteran of the bench who'd been practicing law since Truman was president. Robert Hollies sat at the defense table in a suit that probably cost more than most people in the courtroom made in a month, flanked by Bill Brennan and another lawyer Miller didn't recognize. His face was composed, but there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested barely controlled anger. Margaret sat in the back row with Helen, both of them dressed conservatively, trying to be invisible. Miller caught her eye and gave a small nod. She nodded back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The assistant district attorney, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who'd only been out of law school for 2 years, presented the state's case. She was nervous. You could hear it in the slight tremor in her voice, but she laid out the facts clearly and methodically. The hearing on Monday morning was held in the Greene County Courthouse, a brick building with white columns that had been standing since before the Civil War. Judge Harrison Blackwell presided, a 68-year-old veteran of the bench who'd been practicing law since Truman was president. Robert Hollies sat at the defense table in a suit that probably cost more than most people in the courtroom made in a month, flanked by Bill Brennan and another lawyer Miller didn't recognize. His face was composed, but there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested barely controlled anger. Margaret sat in the back row with Helen, both of them dressed conservatively, trying to be invisible. Miller caught her eye and gave a small nod. She nodded back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Defendant locked his wife outside during a severe thunderstorm. Temperature was 42 degrees. Victim was outside for over an hour. Defendant could see her through the window, but refused to let her in. Sheriff Miller witnessed the victim in distress and arrested the defendant for domestic assault. Brennan stood up, his expensive suit rustling. "Your Honor, this is a gross overreach by law enforcement. This was a private domestic matter, a marital dispute. My client and his wife had an argument. He asked her to step outside to cool down. She chose to stay out there." "She chose?" Sarah Chen's voice cut through the courtroom. "The door was locked, Your Honor. The victim had no key. The defendant deliberately locked her out in dangerous weather conditions. That's not a choice. That's imprisonment." Judge Blackwell looked over his reading glasses at Brennan. "Counselor, are you arguing that Mrs. Hollies voluntarily stood in a thunderstorm for over an hour?" "I'm arguing that this is being blown out of proportion." "Answer the question. Did she have a key to get back inside?" Brennan hesitated. "No, Your Honor, but..." Then she didn't choose to stay outside. She was locked out. Continue, Ms. Chen. Sarah outlined the state's request. Bail set at $5,000. Protective order prohibiting Robert from contacting Margaret or coming within 500 feet of her. Surrender of any firearms in the home. Brennan objected to all of it. Your Honor, Mr. Hollies is a respected businessman with deep ties to this community. He's not a flight risk. He has no criminal record. These restrictions are excessive. He locked his wife outside in a storm, Judge Blackwell said flatly. I'd say these restrictions are appropriate. Bail is set at $5,000. Mr. Hollies is prohibited from any contact with the victim and must stay at least 500 feet away from her person and residence. Any firearms must be surrendered to the sheriff's department within 24 hours. Robert's face went red. He leaned over to whisper something to Brennan, who put a hand on his arm in a clear gesture to calm down. Furthermore, the judge continued, this case will proceed to trial. Preliminary hearing is set for 3 weeks from today. Mr. Hollies, do you understand these conditions? Robert stood, his jaw tight. Yes, Your Honor. Good. If you violate any of these conditions, you'll be back in jail. Do we have an understanding? Yes, Your Honor. Robert's face went red. He leaned over to whisper something to Brennan, who put a hand on his arm in a clear gesture to calm down. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the courtroom. Margaret let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Outside the courthouse, Miller found Margaret and Helen standing on the steps, looking dazed. How are you holding up? He asked. I don't know, Margaret said honestly. I keep waiting to feel guilty, for ruining his reputation, for getting him arrested, but I just feel relieved. That's because you didn't do anything wrong, Miller said. He did, you're just dealing with the consequences of his choices. Helen put an arm around her sister. Come on, let's get you home. As Robert Hollies was released
Miller
from
noticed
custody
Bill
at
Brennan
3
standing
lay
near
in
the
bed in a
courthouse
small
entrance,
house on the
talking
exactly
on a payphone,
24
staring
hours
after
when
the
Brennan
surroundings
saw
and
the
thinking
sheriff
about
walk. He
Korea.
emerged from
He
the
turned
holding
about
cell,
the decisions
but
he
not
made
before
there.
Miller
The
caught
orders
his
he
expressions
followed
and the
was
ones he
calculation
calculation and malice
damp.
about the purple
His
heart.
expression
They'd given Miller had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize
sergeant
someone was
returned his
planning
belt,
and how
his
the medal
wallet
had
he made his
never
wedding
felt
ring
something
to keep his
which he'd been
guard
required to
Just
wrap
a
after
reminder
during
of a
booking. Miller
moment
got a
when
call
Robert
from
wrote
the
them
right
on his
Commissioner
nearly
Harold
cost
Peterson,
us
signed the
everything.
property
Tom,
receipt.
this
We
felt
walked
out
out
about
about this
this
not
without
in
a word
scale,
to anyone.
obviously.
What about it?
His
Nobody
Cadillac
was
was still
him,
powerful,
but
but the
the
principle
principle
was
was
the
the
same. So he had to
Sometimes
you
my
had to take
job,
a stand,
Harold,
a humiliation
your job
is
is to
not
keep the peace,
having to be
especially
specially
when
respected
citizens
citizens over
Watkins'
domestic
ancient
squabbles. At 2 in the morning, his
He
phone
locked
rang.
his
While
wife
people
outside
stared Miller
in a
answered
storm
it
for over an
expecting
hour.
another threatening
That's not a
corners.
squabble.
Instead,
That's a crime.
he
He
heard
heard
Margaret
Margaret
Hollies'
Hollies'
you know what I
voice
mean?
He
Shaky
found the
Robert
front door
Hollies is
repaired.
important.
Sheriff
Ambulance
Miller,
counties
I'm
should not
sorry
raise.
to call so
He
late.
employs
I just
48
I need to
sheriff
tell you
He
something.
pays more in property taxes
Had a carpenter
than anyone else
scheduled
in
to
Green
come Monday
County.
to fix this proper.
You really want to
You'll get the
jeopardize
bill.
all that over one bad
Inside,
night. The house was
Miller
exactly
felt his
as
temper
he'd left
rise,
it,
but
except
kept
kept
his
his
voice
voice level. Someone,
Harold,
probably that
are you
interfering
asking me to
sheriff,
drop
had
charges
put away the
against a man
groceries
who
and
committed
washed the
assault
dishes
because he's wealthy?
Robert stood in his
I'm
living
asking
room
you to use
in his
some
expensive
discretion
house
to
full
think
of
about the
expensive
bigger
things,
picture.
and felt
The bigger
full
picture
weight
is
of what
that
had happened
if Robert
settle on his
Hollies can lock
shoulders.
his wife out with no
Margaret was
consequences,
gone. He
then
knew that
every
without
other
having
man
to
in this
check the
county
bedroom,
will think he can
without
do the
having to
same.
look for her clothes
That's
in
the
the
precedent
closet.
you're asking me
She
to
was
set.
gone, and unless
There was
he
a
missed
long
his
pause.
guess, she wasn't
You're
coming
making a
back.
mistake, Tom.
He could
This isn't
fight it,
going
of
to end
course.
well for you.
Hire lawyers,
Maybe not.
make it
but I
difficult,
can live with
drag
that.
it out in court.
Miller hung up
He had
and
the
sat
money
back in
and the
his chair,
connections to make
staring at the
Margaret's life
ceiling.
hell if he
He'd
wanted
known
to.
there would be pushback.
But he also had
in
the
a
sense
small
to know
county
that
where
Sheriff
everyone
Tom
knew
Miller
everyone
would be watching,
where power and money
and that
meant
if Robert
something.
Hollies ever
Going
stepped
after
out of
someone
line
like
again,
Robert Hollies
if he
was
so
bound
much
to
as
cause
raised his
problems.
voice to his wife
But
in
he'd
public,
meant what he said
Miller
to
would be
Peterson.
there.
He
And
could
next
live
time
with
the
the professional
consequences might be
consequences.
worse than a night
What he
in a
couldn't
cell.
live with was the
Robert
alternative.
walked to his bar
Letting
cart,
powerful
poured
men
himself
abuse
3
their
fingers
wives
of
with
whiskey,
impunity,
and stood at the
The
window
pressure
looking out
continued
at the
to build
fields he
over the
owned,
following
the
weeks.
land he'd
The
inherited
county
from his
commission
father,
called
the
a special
empire he'd
meeting
built.
to discuss the sheriff's
None of it
department
seemed to
budget.
matter much anymore.
The local newspaper,
That Sunday,
which was
Margaret
owned by
Hollies
Robert's
attended
cousin,
services
ran
at
an
First Baptist
editorial
Church for the
questioning
first
Miller's
time in
judgment.
3 months.
Anonymous
She sat in the
letters
back row
appeared
with
in his
Helen and her
mailbox,
family,
some
and
threatening,
when people
some
whispered
pleading,
and stared,
all
she
asking
held
him
her
to
head
drop the
high
case.
and sang every
His
hymn.
phone rang at all
After the
hours
service,
with hang-ups and
Pastor
heavy
Reynolds
breathing.
took her aside
But
in the
Miller
fellowship
didn't back
hall,
down.
while people
He showed
milled
up to
around
work
every
eating coffee
day,
cake,
did his job,
and avoiding
and waited
looking
for the
directly at her.
preliminary hearing.
Margaret,
Margaret,
he said kindly,
meanwhile,
I heard
was
about what
discovering
happened.
what
Are
it
you all
meant to be
right?
at the center of
I
a
am
scandal
pastor,
in a small
or I
town.
will be.
People
If you
stared
need
at her in the
anything,
grocery
counseling,
store.
financial
Former
assistance,
friends
anything
crossed
at
the
all,
street to
please
avoid
let me
talking
know.
to her.
Thank you.
Someone spray
But right
painted
now, what I need
"Homewrecker"
most
on her
is
car.
to figure out what comes
But
next.
there were also
He
unexpected
nodded,
moments
understanding.
of support.
The
"Well,
woman who
whatever
worked
you
at the
decide,
post office
you should know
slipped
that
her
you
a
have
note that
friends
said
here.
simply,
Not
"Thank
everyone."
you for being brave."
He glanced meaningfully
The
at the
pastor's
deacon's
wife
wives
invited her to
clustered in the
coffee,
corner,
but
listened
enough.
without judgment.
That was the second
3 other
time
women
someone
in
had told her
town
that in as
quietly
many
reached
days.
out to share their
And this
own
time,
stories of abuse.
Margaret chose to believe
Helen
it.
stayed with her through
Sheriff
all of
Tom
it,
Miller
fierce
watched all
and
of this from a
protective.
distance.
"Let them
The
talk,"
way he watched
she
most
said when
things
Margaret
in Green
came home
County,
crying after someone
quietly,
spit at her feet
carefully,
outside the
with the
drugstore.
patient attention
They're
of a
just
man
showing you
who'd
who they
learned that
really
the most
are.
important work
The preliminary
often
hearing
happened in
came and
silence.
went.
On
The
Monday
judge
morning,
found
he
sufficient
drove out
evidence
to the Hollies
proceed to
farmhouse
trial.
one more time.
Robert's lawyers
This time
filed
with a
motions
carpenter
to
named
dismiss,
Pete Simmons,
motions to
who
suppress
installed
evidence,
a new door
motions
frame,
to do
and a
anything
solid
that
oak
might
door
make the
that would
case
last
go away.
another 50 years.
All were denied. The bill came
And
to
through it all,
$37.50,
Sheriff Tom Miller kept his head down,
which Robert
and his
Hollies
resolve
paid by
firm,
check,
even
without as the
comment,
pressure
when
mounted,
it arrived in
and
the
the
mail.
threats grew more explicit.
Miller never spoke to Robert directly again, but he made sure to drive past the farmhouse twice a week, just to keep an eye on things. And whenever he saw Margaret Hollies in town, which was more often now that she'd taken a job as a bookkeeper at the feed store, he'd tip his hat the way he always did, a gesture of respect from an earlier time. By Christmas, Margaret had filed for divorce. By spring, it was final. She moved into a small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street and started building a life that belonged to her alone. Not to her husband, not to anyone's expectations, but to her own choices and her own strength. And on quiet nights when the rain fell on Greene County and the roads turned to rivers of mud, she would stand at her window and watch the water stream down the glass. And she would remember the sound of a door being broken down, remember the quiet authority in Sheriff Miller's voice when he'd said, "In Greene County, we don't treat women like livestock." She would remember, and she would be grateful that there were still men in this world who understood that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to make things right. If you're reading this, maybe you see something of yourself in Margaret's story. Maybe you know what it's like to stand outside in the cold, literally or figuratively, while someone who's supposed to love you locks you out and turns up the television. Maybe you've told yourself it's not that bad, that you're being too sensitive, that if you just tried harder, did better, remembered the dry cleaning or kept the house cleaner or smiled more, things would be different. Let me tell you something that Sheriff Tom Miller would tell you if he were here. That's a lie. A cruel, vicious lie that keeps good people trapped in bad situations. What Robert Hollies did to Margaret wasn't a mistake. It wasn't anger. It was a deliberate choice to inflict suffering on someone weaker, someone he thought he owned. And if someone is treating you that way, whether it's a spouse, a parent, a boss, or anyone else, you don't have to stand there and take it. There are people who will help, not everyone maybe, but enough. Shelters, hotlines, churches, law enforcement, friends you haven't talked to in years because he isolated you from them. Reach out, make the call, walk through the door, or let someone break it down for you. Because you deserve better than standing in the rain. You deserve warmth, safety, dignity. You deserve to be treated like a human being, not livestock. And anyone who tells you different is selling you the same lie that kept Margaret Hollies locked outside for an hour in a thunderstorm. Don't buy it, not for another minute. 2 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, Miller got a visit from the county attorney. "Tom, I'm going to be straight with you. The commission has voted to cut your department's budget by 30%. Miller looked up from his paperwork. "Let me guess, that decision has nothing to do with the Hollies case." The attorney had the grace to look uncomfortable. "They're calling it fiscal responsibility, but yeah, we both know what this is about. 30% means I'll have to lay off deputies. Jake Henderson probably, maybe both of the night shift guys. I know, I'm sorry. Are you, or are you just the messenger?" The attorney stood up. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing, but sometimes the right thing comes with a cost." "Yeah," Miller said, "it usually does." After he left, Miller sat alone in his office and thought about what the budget cuts would mean. Fewer patrols, slower response times, maybe even more crime as word got out that the sheriff's department was understaffed. All because he'd arrested a man for locking his wife outside in a storm. He could still drop the charges. Even now, with the trial days away, he could call the DA and recommend dismissal. Robert would go free, Margaret would be shamed back into silence, and the budget would magically be restored. Miller stood up, put on his hat, and walked out to his patrol car. He had work to do. The night before the trial, Miller couldn't sleep. He lay in bed in his small house on the edge of town, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Korea. About the decisions he'd made there, the orders he'd followed, and the ones he'd refused. About the Purple Heart they'd given him for getting shot while pulling a wounded soldier out of enemy fire. And how the medal had never felt like something to be proud of, just a reminder of a moment when doing the right thing had nearly cost him everything. This felt similar, not in scale, obviously. Nobody was shooting at him. But the principle was the same. Sometimes you had to take a stand even when it was easier not to, especially when it was easier not to. At 2 in the morning, his phone rang. Miller answered it, expecting another threatening call. Instead, he heard Margaret Hollies' voice, shaky and small. "Sheriff Miller, I'm sorry to call so late. I needed to tell you something." "What is it, Mrs. Hollies?" "I heard about the budget cuts, about what this is costing you. And I want you to know that if you need to drop the case, I understand. I don't want you to lose your job because of me." Miller sat up in bed, turning on the lamp. "Mrs. Hollies, I appreciate that, but this isn't about you. This is about what's right. Your husband broke the law. He needs to face consequences for that. If I back down now, what message does that send? That powerful people can do whatever they want?" "Exactly. And I didn't become a sheriff to protect powerful people. I became a sheriff to protect people like you." He heard her take a shaky breath. "Thank you. That means more than you know. You get some rest now. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. You too, Sheriff, and thank you for everything." After she hung up, Miller sat in the darkness for a while, thinking. Then he turned off the light and went back to sleep. The trial never happened. At 8 o'clock the next morning, 2 hours before it was scheduled to begin, Bill Brennan called the DA's office. Robert Hollies wanted to take a plea deal. Guilty to misdemeanor assault, 1-year probation, mandatory anger management classes, $1,000 fine, and most importantly, a permanent protective order keeping him away from Margaret. Sarah Chen called Miller with the news. "He caved," she said, barely containing her excitement. "We won." "You won," Miller corrected. "You built the case. I just made the arrest." "We both know that's not true. You put your career on the line for this." "Just doing my job." "Well, your job saved someone's life. You know that, right?" Miller thought about Margaret standing on that porch in the rain. Thought about what might have happened if he hadn't driven past that night, if he'd decided it wasn't his business. "I know," he said quietly. The budget cuts went through anyway. Miller had to lay off Jake Henderson, which hurt worse than any political pressure. Jake was a good deputy, and he deserved better. But at the next county commission meeting, something unexpected happened. 3 commissioners who'd voted for the cuts faced recall petitions signed by hundreds of voters. The local chapter of the League of Women Voters issued a statement condemning the retaliation against the sheriff. And most surprisingly, 5 women came forward at the meeting to testify about their own experiences with domestic abuse and how Sheriff Miller's actions had given them the courage to seek help. The commission didn't restore the budget immediately, but they stopped trying to force Miller to resign. And in the next election cycle, 2 of the commissioners who'd voted for the cuts lost their seats. Progress, Miller thought, came in small increments. Sometimes you had to lose a battle to win a war. "I know that, sir, but I can live with the consequences. I couldn't live with leaving her out there in the cold."